I met Isabella in a bar on the outskirts of Madrid. I was there on business to discuss investments with a Spanish partner. We finished the meeting that evening and, tired of the numbers, I went for a glass of wine somewhere quiet. The bar was small with subdued lighting, a mahogany counter, and soft music that seemed to weave a web around me. And there I saw her. She was sitting at the counter, her legs crossed, wearing a short black dress that caught the light and seemed to draw everyone's attention. Her hair thick, dark brown, with a slight sheen flowed in waves over her shoulders. Her lips a rich red, as if made for sin. But most of all, it was her eyes. Deep brown, with golden sparkles that shone even in the dim light. I ordered a glass of wine, but I couldn't tear my eyes away, and she noticed. She smiled, biting her lip slightly. The movement was simple, but I felt a tightening in my chest. "You're looking at me like I stole your drink," she said with a slight accent as I approached. I smiled back, "No, but if you did, I wouldn't mind." She laughed, a ringing but not loud sound like music. "Isabella," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "Michael," I replied. Her palm was warm, soft, yet strong. She held my hand a little longer than was customary, and I sensed a hint of playfulness. We talked, and time disappeared. She told me about herself. She was born in Barcelona, studied design, but quit because the fashion world was too cruel. She worked as a translator and sometimes as a model. She loved to travel. Her words flowed like wine, and I listened, unable to get enough. When she laughed, her shoulders trembled slightly, and her fingers glided over the glass. Every movement she made was simultaneously innocent and seductive. She knew how to influence men, and she did it effortlessly. I caught myself looking not only at her eyes, but also at the curve of her neck, the delicate line of her collarbones, the way the fabric of her dress hugged her body, and desire flared within me. "Have you come on business?" she asked, tilting her head slightly to the side. "Yes, business." I shrugged, "but now I have a reason to stay." She smiled again. "Or maybe it's just the wine." "No," I said quietly, "it's you." She didn't look away. Late that evening, we left the bar together. The Madrid night was aglow with lights, the air filled with the aromas of coffee and smoke. She walked beside me, her hand brushing mine every now and then. "I live nearby," she said, looking at me searchingly. I stopped, my heart pounding. She didn't rush me, just waited. I nodded. Her apartment was on the third floor of an old building. A narrow staircase, the scent of wood and wine. She opened the door, and I entered a space filled with her scent, a mixture of jasmine, expensive perfume, and something sweet, almost elusive. She took off her shoes, stepped barefoot across the parquet floor, and glanced over her shoulder. Her dress slipped slightly off her shoulder, revealing a thin line of skin. "Wine?" she asked. "Yes. But first," I stepped closer. She didn't pull away. On the contrary, she approached. Our lips met, and everything disappeared: time, the city, the world. All that remained were her lips, soft and warm, and her body pressed against mine. I ran my hand through her hair, down her back, feeling every line, every curve. Her breathing quickened. She quietly breathed out my name, and I realized I was caught in a net from which I would never want to escape. That night was the beginning of the end, but I didn't know it then. I fell asleep in her bed and woke up in the morning to the sun's rays. She lay next to me, her hair spread out across the pillow, her lips slightly parted. I looked at her and thought, I'm ready to trust this woman with everything. It was precisely this trust that once cost me $500,000. I always thought I knew women. I seemed to be able to distinguish true affection from play. But with Isabella, for the first time, I lost my bearings. She was too different. One moment playful, like a girl, the next as alluring as a femme fatale from a movie poster, and I, a rational person, no longer understood where the truth ended and her magic began. The morning after our first night was strangely calm. Usually, after casual encounters, I felt a slight emptiness, a desire to leave and leave everything without continuation. But this was different. I watched her walk around the kitchen barefoot, wearing my shirt, which seemed too big for her, and felt an almost homely warmth. She smiled as she made coffee and seemed so at ease, as if we'd been together for years. You look at me as if you want to remember every detail, she said, handing me the cup. Exactly, I answered honestly. She bit her lip lightly and, without breaking her gaze, slowly sat down next to me. She smelled of coffee and jasmine. We spent almost the entire day together, strolling through narrow streets, popping into small shops, eating ice cream by the fountain. She held my hand as if we'd always been together. People looked at us and probably thought we were a couple in love. I was beginning to believe it myself. Isabella had a way of speaking that made every word penetrate deeply. She told stories from her life, about her childhood by the sea, her first modeling job, about how she was once deceived at a casting. Sometimes there was a hint of sadness in her voice, but her eyes remained strong. "The world doesn't forgive the naive Michael," she said one evening. "If you trust too quickly, you'll definitely be betrayed." I laughed. "Funny, because I trust you." She paused for a second and then smiled. "Maybe that's why I'm still here." With each passing day, I felt more and more drawn to her. Her beauty was almost dangerous. Sometimes I caught myself simply admiring it. The curve of her hip, when she sat down, the movement of her fingers when she adjusted her hair, the slender ankles. When she walked across the room, she knew I was watching, and sometimes she played along, slowly raising her eyes, lingering her hand on the button of her dress, taking a step closer than necessary. It was all innocent and yet maddening. We spent nights together. I remember one particularly clearly. She lay on the sheets, the moonlight falling on her body, and I thought I'd never seen anything more beautiful. She touched me slowly, as if studying my every reaction, and whispered my name in a way that made everything inside me burn. In those moments, I didn't think about money, about work, about life. Only she existed. But even on those nights, I noticed oddities. Sometimes she'd turn away abruptly, as if she didn't want me to see her eyes. Sometimes she'd go out on the balcony to smoke and return a different woman, tensed, as if she were deciding something within herself. I'd ask, "Is everything okay?" She'd smile. "Of course, just lost in thought," and I believed her. After a couple of weeks, we became inseparable. I'd cancel meetings, reschedule activities just to be with her. She had a way of making me forget everything. "You're too serious, Michael," she said one day, sitting on my bed in a thin robe that barely concealed her body. "Life is short. Sometimes you have to take risks, and if the risk doesn't pay off, then at least you'll have the memory of trying." She came closer, touched my face, and added, "And I want you to remember me always." I didn't know then how literally she meant those words. One evening we were sitting at her house, drinking wine. I told her about my work, about how long I'd spent building my fortune. $500,000, a sum I considered a kind of personal shield. Money that was supposed to guarantee that my life would be free of disaster. She listened attentively. Her eyes narrowed slightly. $500,000, she repeated quietly. "That's freedom." "Yes," I agreed. "But money also means responsibility." She chuckled. "Men like to justify their greed with the word responsibility." I smiled, thinking she was simply playing with words. But a shadow flickered in her gaze. She was especially passionate that night. It seemed she was trying to prove something to me, to herself, or to me. I couldn't tell. Her movements were quick, demanding, her lips greedy. It was as if she wanted to erase all my doubts with one touch. I gave in. I was hers. It was during those weeks that I realized I was ready to trust her with everything. I didn't know that this very trust would become my biggest mistake. With Isabella, days began to feel like something new. I can't remember the last time I woke up feeling like the world was created for me. She knew how to give me that feeling with just a look, a touch, even just silence. We began living almost together, sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. My suits gradually migrated to her closet, her cosmetics to my bathroom. It happened so naturally that I didn't even notice how I stopped calling her my friend or my girlfriend and started thinking, "She's mine." We spent evenings on the balcony, looking at the city lights and talking about everything. She asked about my childhood in London, how I made my first money, what success meant to me. I answered honestly. For the first time in my life, I was ready to open up completely. "I've always been afraid of losing what I have," I confessed once. "This money is a guarantee for me." "Security." Isabella looked at me with a slight smile. "Money doesn't protect you. It only makes you a target." But without it, I hesitated. Without it, it'll be that boy again, the one with nothing. She came closer and placed her hand on my cheek. "Michael, you're wrong. Without money, you'll still be who you are. But I understand your fear. Maybe that's why I'm here." I squeezed her hand. "I don't want to lose you." She smiled, but a shadow flickered in her eyes that I couldn't decipher then. Those were the days when I began to think about the future. For the first time, I saw a woman next to me with whom I could share my life. I even imagined the wedding. She in white, me in a formal suit, and no one could separate us. Perhaps that was when I made my first mistake. I decided to let her into my life, not only emotionally, but also materially. One evening, while we were drinking wine at my place, she asked, "Do you trust me?" I smiled. Of course. So much so that you could trust me with the most important thing. I thought about it. And what does most important mean to you? She leaned closer, her hair brushing my face. Everything you're afraid of losing. I didn't answer right away, but the next day I showed her access to my investment account. Not everything, of course, but I told her how much I had, where I kept the money, and what trades I made. She listened with interest, asking questions. She seemed genuinely fascinated by this world of numbers. $500,000, she repeated, looking at the laptop screen. Michael, do you realize that's half a lifetime for most people? For me, it's the result of my work, I said. I didn't steal it. I didn't win it. I earned it. She looked at me intently. What's earned is more valuable than what's stolen. But stolen is always sweeter. I chuckled, thinking it was just a play on words. But those words echoed in my head for a long time. With each passing day, I became more and more drawn into her world. She took me to her favorite places, small cafes, antique shops, nightclubs where she danced so hard that the men round her held their breath. I was jealous. At first, slightly, then more intensely. Her beauty was a weapon, and she knew it. But every time I looked at her with a shadow of doubt, she laughed, hugged me, and whispered, "Silly, you know I chose you." And I believed. One day, I caught her at my house looking through my documents. She looked up and smiled as if it were the most natural thing to do. "Just curious about how your world works," she said. I didn't suspect a thing. On the contrary, I was flattered by her curiosity. I even started telling her more than I should have. About deals, about connections, about where and how my reserves were stored. That was the second mistake. Our nights grew increasingly heated. It was as if she wanted to dissolve me in herself, to deprive me of my mind. I remember one night particularly clearly. Her body was hot, her movements were bold, and her eyes were such that I felt I was ready to give everything. If only she would keep looking at me like that. And I gave attention, time, energy, and soon I had to give more. Sometimes she would disappear for a couple of hours, saying she was meeting a friend or traveling on business. I didn't pay any attention to it. The trust was too strong, and the jealousy too foolish. "You're not stalking me, are you?" she asked one day with a playful smile. "Of course not, and rightly so, because I'll always come back to you." She said it so confidently that I believed her. At the end of the third week of our romance, I felt ready to take it a step further. We were sitting in a restaurant, the candles reflected in her eyes. I took her hand and said, "I think we can start something serious." She raised her eyebrows. "Aren't we serious already? I mean, more than just a relationship." She smiled slowly, and I felt my insides tighten. "Are you asking me to stay forever?" "Yes," I replied. She looked out the window, then back at me. There was something strange in her gaze, a mixture of tenderness and anxiety. "Forever is a long time, Michael. Are you sure you know who you're tying your life to?" I nodded. "Absolutely certain." She said nothing. She just took my hand and squeezed it tightly. I didn't realize then that this was her way of saying goodbye. I always told myself that trust is the foundation of any relationship. Without trust, there's no love, no friendship, not even business. But trust became my Achilles heel. With Isabella, it grew too quickly, like a weed taking over the entire garden. And then one day, I began to notice the cracks. At first, they were small things. She'd stay late, explaining that she was meeting friends I'd never heard of. Sometimes her phone would ring in the middle of the night, and she'd disappear into another room, answering in a whisper. When I asked who it was, she'd smile and say, "Little things, Michael. Don't worry about it." I believed, or pretended to believe. My jealousy grew, not because I had proof of infidelity, but because Isabella was a woman everyone was drawn to. Men would turn around on the street, waiters would forget to bring orders, captivated by her eyes. She could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. I hated it, but even more, I hated my own impotence. "You're jealous," she said one evening when I'd been silent for too long at dinner. "Maybe," she chuckled. Jealousy makes men vulnerable, and at the same time honest. Does that make you happy? She leaned closer. I'm glad you're afraid of losing me. It means I'm important to you. Sometimes she played with it. At parties, she'd flirt with other men a little longer than was appropriate, laugh at their jokes, lightly touch their hands. I burned inside, but I didn't show it. And then she'd come back to me, hug me, and whisper, "You're the only one. Don't forget that." These words always calmed me, but not for long. There were other oddities, too. One day, I noticed I had files open on my laptop that I hadn't looked at. Bills, contracts, personal notes. I asked her if she'd touched the computer. She looked at me innocently. Of course not. I barely understand what you have there. I didn't argue. But somewhere inside, something pricked. Her nighttime walks became more frequent. I can't sit at home all the time, she explained. I need movement, fresh air. I tried to suggest going out with her, but she refused. Sometimes a woman needs time alone. I agreed, but my anxiety grew. My friends began to notice the changes. You've changed, Michael, my business partner, Andrew, said one day. You've become nervous, absent-minded. Is it because of her? Don't be silly, I dismissed. I'm just tired. But I knew he was right. Isabella consumed my thoughts completely. Even when she wasn't around, I thought about her. Where was she? Who was she with? What was she doing? One night, I woke up and didn't find her by my side. I got up and went into the living room. It was empty. The door to the balcony was open. She was standing there, smoking, looking out over the city. Are you awake? I asked. She flinched as if she hadn't expected to see me. I just can't sleep. You've been acting strange lately, I said carefully. Are you hiding something? She took a drag, blew out the smoke, and looked straight into my eyes. Michael, everyone has secrets, even you. But we're together, yes. She smiled mysteriously. That's why I stay here. I tried to convince myself that all of this was just the fruit of my jealousy. But a voice inside me whispered, be careful. You've gotten too carried away. And yet, I continued to love her even more. Maybe that was her power. One day we went out of town to a small house by the sea. I wanted peace and quiet, solitude. We walked along the beach, laughed, and swam in the cold water at night. She seemed happy. It's so peaceful here, she said, clinging to me. You know, sometimes I think I could live like this forever. Then stay. She looked at me and stroked my cheek. Maybe. But her voice sounded as if she didn't believe her words. That night, for the first time, I felt despair. I realized I was holding a woman close to me who was slipping through my fingers, like water. The tighter you squeeze, the faster you lose her. I didn't know then that loss was already at the door. A few days later, I received a strange notification from the bank. My account had been accessed from a different device. I called to confirm, and they said everything was fine. The access details were correct. No violations. I frowned. I definitely hadn't logged in. And for the first time, a thought flashed through my mind. What if it was her? I pushed it away, but the seed of doubt was planted. With each passing day, Isabella grew closer and further away at the same time. She gave me nights of passion and days of laughter, but behind it all, there was always a shadow. Her eyes, so deep and beautiful, sometimes seemed cold. I told myself she's just a complicated woman. She has her own demons. But somewhere deep inside, I already knew the truth. I don't remember the exact day when I realized something had changed irreversibly. It was like a fog that gradually thickened until it obscured the entire horizon. Isabella smiled, joked, touched my hands, everything as before. But her eyes were different. They no longer laughed. The morning began as usual. I was getting ready for a meeting with my partners, and she lay in bed, lazily watching me put on my suit. You're too serious, Michael, she said, yawning. Sometimes I think your tie is more important than me. You're wrong, I replied, kissing her forehead. You're more important than anything. She smiled, but there was something elusive in that smile, a farewell. I stayed late at work that day. I returned home that evening, and for the first time, I felt emptiness. The apartment was quiet, as if no one had ever lived there. There was no scent of her perfume, no sandals by the door, no laughter that used to fill the rooms. I called out, Isabella? There was no answer. At first, I thought she'd gone out to see a friend. I dialed her number. The ringing continued endlessly, but she didn't pick up. I texted, where are you? And then silence again. My stomach tightened, but I pushed away the worry. Maybe she was just tired, didn't want to talk. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The phone remained silent. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest. I checked my email and went cold. Several emails from the bank were waiting in my inbox. Confirmations of transfers. Large transfers. 5 transactions. Different accounts. Amount $500,000. I reread the emails several times, hoping it was a mistake. But the numbers remained the same. My money was gone. My hands were shaking as I called the bank. They confirmed the transfers were made correctly using my details. No violations. But I didn't make those transfers. I almost screamed into the phone, "Mr. Roland, we have access confirmation and identification," the employee replied calmly. Everything was done according to the rules. I went limp. So someone else had access, and I knew who. I paced the apartment like a caged animal, checking drawers, documents, even small items. Not only had everything vanished from the bank accounts, Isabella was gone too. Her things, dresses, cosmetics, even her favorite coffee mug had vanished without a trace. She'd packed everything up. She'd left as if she'd never lived there. I stood in the empty room, unable to breathe. For the first few hours, I tried to find an explanation. Maybe she'd been kidnapped. Maybe she'd been forced. Maybe she's the victim, not the traitor. But the more I looked at the empty shelves, the emails confirming transfers, the unanswered messages, the more I realized she did it herself. Isabella stole everything from me. I called Andrew. My voice trembled as I said, "She left, and she took the money." "How much?" "Everything. $500,000. There was silence on the other end. Then he said, "Michael, I warned you." I wanted to get angry, to scream, but I had no strength. I just sat on the floor and clasped my head in my hands. In the following days, I tried to find her. I called hotels, asked friends, searched the bank for traces. Nothing. She vanished like smoke. Her number was no longer answering. Her social media accounts were deleted. Even the address she'd claimed was her apartment in Barcelona turned out to be fictitious. I realized I'd never really known her life. Everything she told me about her childhood, her work, her friends could have been a lie. I slept hours a night, the rest of the time trying to piece together the puzzle. But only one picture emerged. I'd fallen victim to the most exquisite scam imaginable. And yet, I couldn't hate her. I remembered her laughter, her eyes, her touch, the body I loved every night, the words she whispered to me as I fell asleep. "You're the only one. Don't forget that." How could anyone believe that? How could anyone confuse a lie with love? One evening, I found a small scrap of paper on my nightstand. I don't know how I hadn't noticed it before. It contained just one sentence, written in her handwriting. "You trusted me, and that's what made you special." No explanation, no apology, just those words. I clutched the note in my fist and felt something inside me break completely. I had lost more than just money. I had lost myself. I don't know how much time passed after she disappeared. Days and nights blended together, losing their shape. The alarm rang, the sun rose and set, but for me, it was all one long, viscous darkness. At first, I searched desperately for her. I called every bank, demanded they cancel the transfers, screamed at lawyers, begged the police. But the louder I screamed, the clearer it became. Nothing could be recovered. They said the transfer was legal, that access had been confirmed, that there was no evidence of a crime. She knew the rules of the game. She knew them better than I did. At night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and every time I saw her, her face leaning over me, her hair spilling over my shoulders, her laughter when I told her I felt happier with her than ever. Sometimes I closed my eyes and smelled her, light, warm with a hint of jasmine. I reached out and my palm touched emptiness. Then I gasped. Something in my chest was tearing apart, but there were no tears, only a dry ache gnawing from within. I began to fear silence. The TV was on 24/7. The radio blared in the car, even when I wasn't listening. I needed something to drown out my own thoughts, but the thoughts kept coming. How could she? I asked myself. Why? Every time I came to the same conclusion. I was a convenient victim, a soft, trusting, lovesick fool for whom a smile was enough to give everything. Andrew came a couple of times. He brought food, tried to get me to talk. "You should get back into business," he said. "Money can be made again." "Money?" I grinned. "You think it's just about money." "No." He sighed. I think you've lost more than just a fortune." I remained silent. He was right. One night, I opened her old jewelry box, a small wooden box where she kept her jewelry. I knew she'd take it if she left, but for some reason it remained. There was nothing valuable inside. A pair of earrings, a necklace, a pressed flower, and a photograph of the two of us on the beach. I was holding her by the waist. She was smiling, shielding her eyes from the sun. I stared at that photograph for a long time, first with longing, then with rage. I tore it into pieces and threw it in the trash. But an hour later, I took it back and glued it back together, as if that would bring back what I'd lost. I tried to remember her touch, but the memories became toxic. I remembered her fingers sliding over my chest, her lips brushing my neck, and I felt not desire, but revulsion. But my body still betrayed me. I only had to close my eyes to crave her. Her scent, her skin, her voice, and that was the most terrible thing. I knew she was a traitor, a thief, that her love was a lie. But part of me still wanted her. I drank a lot, whiskey, wine, whatever was at hand. I wanted to erase my memory, fall asleep, and wake up in a world where nothing had happened. But alcohol only intensified the pain. Instead of sleep, nightmares came. I saw her laughing at my naivety, counting my money, leaving without looking back. I woke up in a cold sweat, clenching my fists until they hurt. One day, I went to the sea. I just got in the car and drove without thinking. I stopped on the shore, stepped out, and the wind hit me in the face. I looked at the waves and tried to imagine that she was somewhere out there beyond the horizon, that maybe she would return, that maybe this was all just a mistake. I waited for a sign, but the sea was silent. At that moment, I realized I was trapped. She hadn't stolen everything from me. I had allowed her to do it myself. I had made her the center of my life. I had handed over the keys to my world. She had simply taken advantage of it. I returned home and looked at myself in the mirror for the first time in a long time. My cheeks were sunken, my eyes dull, my beard sloppy. I looked as if I'd lived 10 years in a single month. "Who are you?" I whispered to my reflection. I didn't recognize the person in the mirror. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I sat by the window, smoking cigarette after cigarette, and wondered, what if I find her? What will I do? Hug her, beg her to come back, or hate her so much I want to kill her? I didn't know the answer, and that's what scared me most. At some point, I realized, if I don't change, if I don't pull myself together, I'll be lost. She took the money, but she shouldn't take my life. It was the beginning of a long journey toward understanding. But the end was still too far away. When all that's left in your life is emptiness, the first steps are the hardest. They seem meaningless, but they're what separates you from the swamp where you risk drowning. I understood this theoretically, but in practice, I felt only the weight of every move. Yet something within me resisted, not a desire for revenge, but something entirely different, the need to reclaim myself. I decided to act. Not to chase her, I still didn't know if that was worth it, but to regain control of my own world. Legal steps first. I called the lawyer again, combed through the contracts, and asked him to check all the accounts she might have used. The office was empty, the partners had distanced themselves, but a few remained on my side. "Michael," said Richard, sitting across from me, "there's a chance to get some of the money back if we find traces of the transfers. But you'll need time and patience." "I have time," I reply, and it wasn't true. I had nothing but a watch and a swollen ache, but not determination. The first thing I did was change my passwords. It seemed like a small thing, but the feeling of control that came with this action was unexpectedly strong. My computer, my smartphone, everything was under my lock. I closed the door on my past, literally and figuratively. The second was work. I started coming to the office, not for show, but to occupy my mind with work. At first, it was more like a ritual. I reviewed old projects, made lists, sorted papers. Each completed item strengthened me, like a slab of wood. But there was another side, the desire to know. Who was she really? How had she managed to so masterfully insinuate herself into my life? I began to piece together the pieces, former addresses, names of friends, photos I'd taken of her in moments of weakness. It was painful, but necessary. I turned to a private investigator. I didn't want to appear desperate. I wanted the facts. The detective, an older man named Martin, proved surprisingly practical. Women who play well usually leave one thing behind, a trace. It could be phone records, a record of hotel receipts, or acquaintances who know too much. I'll start with the finale, the bank transfers. Where did you transfer the money? Where did it go? I gave her all the details, and we began digging. Meanwhile, I was trying to cope with the emotional storm. I made an appointment with a psychologist, an admission that had previously seemed weak to me. The word help sounded proud on her lips. During the first sessions, I simply remained silent and looked at the floor. I spoke briefly when I could no longer contain myself, about how it all began, about her laughter, about the emptiness I felt in the apartment without her. You're experiencing betrayal, the doctor said calmly, and it has transformed into a loss of security. You must at least regain that feeling of security. How? I thought, and answered at the sessions, with deeds. Returning to routine helped little by little. The grind of work reports, meetings, negotiations kept my mind busy, and in between, I thought less about her, but the memory was stubborn. Hear a song, and I'd return to her lips, pass by that car, and suddenly I'd smell her perfume. One day, I met a girl on the subway whose gait reminded me of Isabella, the same gentle sway of her hips, the confident gaze. For a moment, my heart raced, and then shame. I understood that a reflex was lingering. The body remembers pleasure, the mind betrayal. I had to learn one from the other. The next step was money. A private investigator found several traces of transfers. Small sums were sent to cards at various banks. But one chain of transfers led to an account at a small company registered under a false name. The evidence was tentacles, not a network, but it was enough to launch an official investigation. We can file a complaint, Martin said. But we must understand. Extraditing the money and returning it will require the bank's cooperation. And time. I nodded. Time was not on my side, but I had no choice. While the investigation was ongoing, another battle began, an internal one. Every workday, I came home and was confronted with memories. When I tried to go to bed, the image of her departure returned to my mind again and again. At some point, my helplessness gave way to the question, was it really worth hating her to the end? Could I ever trust again? The psychologist talked about trust gradients. You can't open all the doors of your soul. In one fell swoop, they must be opened gradually. But how does this apply to someone who has been completely betrayed by your choice of trust? I found a small amount of support where I least expected. My neighbor on the landing, an elderly man named Juan, noticed my disorientation and occasionally lingered in conversation about the weather, about football, about cleaning the entrance hall. His simple words, "Life goes on, take care of yourself," sounded homely. These little things, so insignificant, helped. One day, one brought me a pie. "Take it step by step," he said. "Life is like renovating an old house, slowly, but if you give up, everything will fall apart." I smiled for the first time in days. 3 weeks after the disappearance, the detective reported that one of the chains of transfers had indeed gone through offshore companies, and then to a wallet registered under the name of a woman, who used a passport with a different name. We received coordinates, a city in Portugal. She could have gone there, Martin said, or passed the money on. "Let's go," I said, and there was no theatrical determination in my voice. There was a quiet, collected will. I understood. This wasn't just a search. This was an attempt to restore justice, or at least to understand why everything had happened this way. The trip to Portugal was short but important. We checked the local hotels, spoke with the receptionist at one, and obtained CCTV footage. A figure appeared in the footage, a silhouette, but the face was hidden by a hood. Lots of little clues, but no direct proof. When I returned, I felt both disappointment and relief. We were moving in the right direction, albeit slowly. Returning home after the trip was strangely warm. I opened the door, and the apartment smelled of a vague emptiness again. But this time, the emptiness wasn't so overwhelming. I made myself dinner, and for the first time in a long time, the taste of food didn't seem foreign. I began to slowly regain my interest in life. I started reading a book I'd put aside before she arrived. I pasted a photo of myself alone, not with anyone else, on my desktop. little markers of my identity. The key moment in my recovery wasn't so much finding the trail, as realizing that my dignity couldn't be given away along with the money. Love and trust are a risk, but they're not a death sentence. I wasn't obligated to keep what had been taken from me. The first steps back were slow and painful, but they were in the right direction, and I no longer allowed the emptiness to eat away at me so easily. The nights were still difficult. Memories came flooding back, sometimes unbearably sharp. But now I had a plan and people nearby who helped keep me from falling completely. And this feeling of support, though small, gave me strength. And for the first time since my disappearance, I allowed myself to consider that perhaps someday I would not only find an answer but also let go. Not because I had forgotten, but because I had become stronger. The path to truth is rarely direct. More often it meanders, forcing you to unravel a tangle of other people's secrets step by step. It was the same with me. The deeper we dug, the harder it became to separate lies from truth and memories from cold, hard facts. Martin called again that morning. His voice was cheerful, yet cautious. "Michael, we have a lead." "What is it this time?" "Money was withdrawn from the account your transfers were deposited into in Portugal. An ATM withdrawal. The camera recorded it." My heart sped up, and a woman in a long coat and dark glasses. Her face is hidden, but her figure. He paused. "I think it might be her." I was silent for a long time. I wanted to scream, "Of course it's her," but I knew I was clinging to a ghost. Even if it's true, the video is just a shadow. We met in his office. He showed me the footage. On the screen was a woman, slender, confident, with a gait I'd recognize among thousands. She adjusted her hair, lowered her head, and my heart sank painfully. "It's her," I whispered. Martin nodded. "We can trace the money's progress. But I warn you, she was clearly preparing." That evening, I couldn't sleep. I saw her again. Not the one who stole the money, but the one who laughed, hugged, and kissed. "You're my only one." How could she have played it like that? I tried to imagine her motives were higher duty, danger, pressure from others. But everything fell apart. The footage from the ATM spoke too clearly of her freedom of choice. A week later, the detective brought new information. The money had passed through a shell company registered in Spain. The director's name was female, but they found something odd in the documents. The birth date matched the one Isabella had once claimed as her own. "She didn't just take your money," Martin said. "She's building something new with it." These words stunned the most. She didn't just run away. She's using my life as the foundation of her own. I thought, what if I meet her again? What will I say? Take it all back? To naive. Why did you do this? What if there's no answer? I still love you, isn't that humiliating? These thoughts tormented me every night. I imagined hundreds of encounter scenarios. In one, I blamed her and left proud. In another, I fell to my knees. In a third, we laughed as if nothing had happened. I understood. Reality would be worse than any imagination. At the psychologist's, I allowed myself to speak out loud about something else for the first time, about attraction. I admitted that I still wanted her. My body remembered her down to the last detail. "That's normal," the doctor said. "Your brain connects betrayal and passion because they happen together. You need to learn to separate them." I clenched my fists. "But how can you separate them if her lips are still here?" "Time and experience," she replied. "But the most important thing is honesty with yourself." I tried to switch gears. I started running in the mornings. At first, my legs ached, my breath hitched, but gradually it began to feel powerful. With every kilometer, I felt at least a little in control of my body and my life. And yet, when I returned home, the shower reminded me of her. I remembered her entering the bathroom, her hair getting wet and sticking to my skin. These images were toxic, but I couldn't erase them. Martin called again. "There's someone who claims to have seen her in Lisbon, a bar on the outskirts, a couple of weeks ago. She wasn't alone." "With whom?" "With a man. Tall, dark hair." I froze. A man. So I wasn't her only one. Never had been. This revelation hit me harder than losing the money. I felt anger welling up in my chest. Real, hot, like red-hot metal. I slammed my fist on the table. Damn, all this time, it was all a lie. Martin looked at me calmly. "Perhaps, but, Michael, it's up to you to decide what to do with this truth." I went outside. The evening was chilly, the air smelled of autumn. I walked along the streets, and it seemed to me that the faces of passers-by looked at me with pity. Her voice echoed in my head. "You're special. Special. No, I was just convenient. I was the one who opened the wallet and the heart. I stopped on the bridge and looked down at the Black River for a long time. The wind blew across my face, my thoughts darting about like birds in a cage, and suddenly I realized, yes, she took the money. Yes, she betrayed me. But the worst thing would be if I let her steal my life too. I returned home and, for the first time in a long time, sat down at my laptop not for the reports, but for myself. I wrote a long document, not a report, not a complaint, but a story. My own. From the very beginning, meeting, love, betrayal. I wrote until my fingers ached, until my eyes watered. It was cathartic. Paper brought out what was tearing me apart inside. A few days later, Martin called again. There's new information. If you're ready, we can go further. Perhaps we'll have a chance to meet her face to face. My heart sank. I'm ready, I replied. But was I really ready? The trip to Lisbon wasn't so much a logical step in the investigation as an impulsive spur to break free from stagnation. I couldn't wait any longer for paper reports or tell the detective where to dig. I needed to see, feel, hear, or be completely convinced that she was a shadow. Martin and I took an early Sunday flight. He boarded the plane with a detached air. As if for yet another checkup, I felt like I was stepping out of the shadows into the light, where I would either find the answer or lose something else entirely. Lisbon greeted us with gray-blue clouds and a salty wind from the Tagus. This city has always struck me as melancholy. Sidewalks, bridges, trams that creaked like the old mechanisms of memory. We went through the list. Street cafes, clubs on the outskirts, one bar in the Alfama district where, according to a witness, she had been spotted. Witness is a dry, scientific word, but I kept searching for a living woman, the one whose fingers traced the contours of my face, the one who whispered, "I'm with you." I felt like if I caught her gaze, much would become clear. Or, conversely, nothing would become clearer. The bar was compact, with low lamps and the smell of overheated whiskey. The light fell in patches, and faces gradually merged into dark silhouettes. I immediately felt something tighten inside. This was her space, noisy, social, easy to hide in. We started with the waiter. He remembered a figure slender, wearing a hat, but he couldn't say for sure if it was her. The bar's cameras were old, some of the recordings had faded, some hadn't been kept for long. Martin had already anticipated such gaps of professional habit, finding threads even where there seemed to be no fabric. Perhaps she was here 2 weeks ago, he said. She was drinking white wine. She was with a man. These words echoed. I remembered seeing her once with another man, now it was confirmed again. But I wasn't just drawn to find out who she'd left with, I longed to see her myself, to hear, to ask, to demand an answer. We walked into a part of town where the narrow streets seemed to create a private labyrinth. People passed by, oblivious to the two strangers walking with a map in their hands. Somewhere in the distance, the noise of a restaurant, somewhere the barking of dogs, somewhere the fado music, which flowed over the stones and reminded us that in this town, sadness was almost a national trait. On the third night, Martin got some information. The wife of a small business owner had seen a woman resembling Isabella in the docks area. She took a video, which she then forwarded to the bartender. This video was everything we needed: a silhouette, steps, facial expressions. The face was not visible, but the gait was the same, and even the manner of adjusting long hair. All these nuances were familiar to me, like road signs. We drove to the docks at dawn. A cold fog over the water made the world fade, but the smell of fuel and fish still hung on the dock. Surveillance cameras at the small warehouses were rarer, but we managed to find one recording. A woman in a coat and dark glasses, getting into a light vehicle. A man stood next to her, over 6 feet tall, broad, placing his hand on her back with an intentness that was impossible to hide. "It's him," I said without a shadow of a doubt. We got the license plate number and followed the trail. The taxi driver who brought the couple to the dock remembered their conversation, a mixture of English and Spanish. The man called the woman Beleza beautiful and laughed as if it were a joke on the world. They talked about leaving, about a new beginning, about how easy everything would be. My heart filled with sour iron bile. a new beginning. Understanding came not like lightning, but like cold water enveloping my body. She hadn't simply stolen the money, she had used it as a ticket to another life, and that ticket had bought not only her freedom, but perhaps the freedom of her companion as well. We proceeded to the port where, as it turned out, a yacht was heading. The sky was gloomy, and the air felt like a gathering storm. I stood at the dock and waited. I expected to see a familiar figure on the deck, to hear her laughter, the same one that had pricked me like a sweet pill before. But the yacht slipped away into the tide, hidden by a curtain of gray sea fog. It suddenly became clear to me that I was pursuing more than just a woman, I was pursuing the image she knew how to create. People around us saw only her silhouette, but to me every feature, every movement was familiar, like the musical notation of a favorite song. And at the same time I understood, finding her means settling the matter, or not settling it. We returned to the city late, tired and silent. That night was a turning point. I didn't care what would happen next, whether I'd catch her or return the money. The most important thing was to step beyond the line she'd crossed and become a subject again, not a victim of someone's game. The next morning, I sat down in a small cafe and opened my notebook. I began writing down questions, not for the sake of abstract clamor, but to define a plan of action. What did I want? To get the money back? To bring her to court? To publicly expose her? Or to regain only part of what had been lost: dignity, control, peace of mind? The to-do list looked realistic. Cooperate with the banks, seek official means of repayment, file lawsuits, engage the media. But at the top, I wrote another, less pragmatic point. Find an answer to the question why. Behind this why lay not only a thirst for justice, but also a desire to understand her motivation. People who steal are usually pursuing something more than money. It could be freedom, adrenaline, revenge, narcissism. In Isabella's case, it seemed everything was intertwined. Desire, calculation, and the deception of skill. That same evening, we received another letter from Martin. His words were brief. "We're not finished yet. We have information. The guy from the yacht is a Brazilian citizen, a businessman with a dubious reputation. He's already on money laundering lists. He could be a link." I felt a slight sense of relief because this man wasn't an abstract image, but a real link. But with it came the understanding that this was no longer a personal drama between two people. It was part of a larger mechanism. The first days in Lisbon had drained me both physically and emotionally. I saw her strength, her ability to dissolve, to recreate herself in a new form, leaving behind only shadows. And somewhere in that same shadow, I saw my own weakness, a willingness to give up what was dear to me for the sake of love. But it couldn't be erased. The past had already happened. On the way back to the hotel, I considered whether our meeting had been a predetermined, ironic twist of fate. She had found what she wanted: resources and vulnerability. I had found what I considered low. But the reality was even harsher. I couldn't take back the time and trust I'd wasted. I could only try to rebuild on a more solid foundation. We discussed our options for a long time, each with its rational advantages and moral disadvantages. In the end, I decided I would see it through, not for revenge, not to destroy her, but for my own restoration. By returning the money, I could reclaim a part of myself. By catching her, I would get answers. And not finding them meant accepting, but not giving up. My last thought before bed, which crept quietly and sarcastically: if her image was skillfully created, then it can be skillfully destroyed. The plan was ready. Not revenge, but work. Practical, cold, and at the same time painful. Dragging the truth out into the open, even if it meant experiencing it again and again. I always thought the climax of such stories was like in movies. The hero finds the traitor, confronts him with the truth, and everything collapses in a single scene. But life works differently. It gives you not just one confrontation, but a series of encounters with facts, with people, with yourself. Returning from Lisbon, I realized the story had grown beyond a personal tragedy. At stake were no longer just my money and my heart, but also the dirty schemes into which Isabella had been drawn. Martin showed his composure again. We have the name of her companion, Rafael Mendoza, Brazilian businessman, about 45 years old. Connections in South America, suspicions of money laundering, but officially clear. He looked at me as if testing my readiness. With him, things are more complicated. I remained silent. The name sounded harsh, alien, and at the same time strangely at home in her new world. Raphael, the man she could trust with my money. We started with the paperwork, lawyers, bank inquiries, complaints. It all felt like trying to catch the wind with a butterfly net. Millions moved through shell companies, through accounts on islands, through investments in new projects, but every trace left a hint the money hadn't vanished into thin air, it was there swirling, bringing profit to someone. In the third week of searching, Martin came to me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. It was something like delight hidden behind a professional mask. They're back in Europe. Amsterdam. The name of the city sent a jolt through me. I knew Amsterdam as a place where people mix freedom and chaos, where it's easy to get lost in the crowd, where you can be anyone. And I realized she was there. We flew out that same evening. Amsterdam greeted us with neon, narrow canals, and the smell of coffee laced with something sweet and forbidden. The evening city was like a stage where thousands of actors were playing their parts. I walked along the pavement and felt that somewhere in this theater she was. Martin had acted according to plan. Through a friend, he'd gotten information about an apartment rented under the name of a company associated with Raphael. The address was in the city center. We approached the building late in the evening. The light in the second floor window was on warm yellow. I looked up and saw a silhouette. She was standing by the window, wearing a long shirt, her hair falling over her shoulders. Even from a distance, I recognized every line, every movement. My heart pounded so hard I felt a pain in my chest. I exhaled. Martin watched intently, emotionless. If you go in there now, you'll lose. She'll say what you want to hear, or she'll laugh in your face. Are you ready for this? I was silent. A battle raged within me. The desire to burst in and demand an answer, and the cold logic that said, wait. We rented a room in a nearby hotel. I barely slept. Every minute felt like torture. I imagined her body, her hands, her lips. I saw how she could look you straight in the eye and tell you lies so tempting you to believe them. This mixture of pain and desire burned inside me. The next morning, we tracked Raphael down. He left the apartment, elegant and confident, and got into his car. I looked at him and understood. This man now held the woman I loved and my money. But most of all, I was tormented by the thought, did he hold her heart? The meeting took place 2 days later. Martin had set a trap. We knew Raphael was negotiating in a restaurant by the canal. I walked in when they were already seated at a table. She, alive, real, Isabella. She was wearing a red dress, her hair pulled back into a high ponytail and dark lipstick. Her gaze darted toward me, and a flicker of surprise followed by a slight smile, as if we'd met by chance on the street, not after a betrayal. Alex, she said calmly. The voice was the same one that had once whispered to me in bed. Are you here? I sat down across from her. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking, but my words came out firmly. I'm here for what you stole. Raphael looked at me with a hint of mockery. He remained silent, giving her the chance to speak. She smiled. Stealed? Alex, we just disagreed on our values. You were too naive. The words cut me. I wanted to scream, but I held back. $500,000 isn't a disagreement on values. It's betrayal. She leaned forward. Her gaze softened. You always saw me better than I am. Maybe that's why you believed me. For a second, I almost gave in. The light I loved flashed in her eyes. But then I noticed the coldness beneath the mask. It was an act. Raphael broke the silence. We're leaving. They stood up. I stood up too. This isn't over, Isabella. I'll give it all back. She smiled again, and that smile was like a slap. Try it. We watched them for a few more days. Martin had collected enough data for official action, companies, accounts, documents. But that wasn't the most important thing for me. I realized that the love I'd lived for was gone. The woman remained smart, beautiful, cruel. My wand remained. And I had a choice, remain a prisoner of this pain or break free. That night, I wrote in my notebook again, the money return, leaving Isabella behind. It was harder than it seemed. Leaving her behind meant admitting that the one I loved died the moment she signed off on the theft. Now there was someone else standing before me, a shadow, an actress, a criminal. But I could still smell her, remember her skin. And I knew only time would erase it. The end of this story is still ahead. Lawsuits, banks, investigations, all of it will take months, maybe years. I don't know how much of what was stolen I'll get back. Maybe half, maybe all, maybe nothing. But I know one thing for sure. I've regained the ability to face the truth. I stopped seeing her as an angel and recognized the demon, and that, perhaps, is the most important victory. Isabella left my life with my money, but she took something else with her illusions, and, strangely, she freed me from them. Now I'm starting over. And yes, perhaps her silhouette in the window, her smile at a table in Amsterdam, will remain in my memory. But it's no longer reality. It's just a shadow, and I will learn to live without her.